Up to here, we have learned the basic functionalities of Octopus Deploy, and we can create projects and deploy them. And now we want to learn more advanced topics. I have taken you through a slide before. I want to show this slide to you again because it's very relevant to what we want to learn in this topic. So if you remember, I said that normally we keep our code in Git, and then we have multiple branches in Git or any source control system that you use, and each branch has a usage. For example, you may have a branch that has a copy of production code, and you have a branch that developers use and it's constantly changing, and we call it development. And you may have a branch that is called, for example, release candidate or RC, and in this branch you only have a code that is being tested and being prepared for deployment to production. Now we have multiple environments. For example, we have a dev environment or development environment, and only developers are allowed to deploy their code to dev environment. That's one criteria. And only the code that is in development branch can go to that dev environment, because that dev environment is for developers to test their code before they send it to the testing team for testing. So we never deploy master branch to dev environment unless we want to put the most reliable code to dev environment or something like that. Normally we accept that dev environment is unstable, and normally developers deploy anything they have in development branch to dev environment so they can test. Now the RC branch can go to QA environment because RC branch is created, for example, from master branch. We know that it is a good code. It's not constantly changing by developers, so it can be tested. The code in development branch is not allowed to go to QA environment because, as I said, development branch is constantly changing. So while testers are testing in QA environment, a new code may just come in and invalidate all the tests. So RC can go to QA environment only. Development branch cannot go to QA environment. And then once the RC branch is properly tested in QA environment, then it can go to production environment. Also, any code that wants to go to production environment has to be in QA environment first. It cannot go directly from RC branch to production environment. And what I just explained in Octopus Deploy is referred to as a life cycle. The life cycle tells us that in order for a package to get to any of these environments, what are the previous steps that we have to take beforehand. And this is what I want to show to you in this lecture. So let's go to Octopus Deploy, and I explain this in Octopus. Okay, so now I'm in Octopus Deploy, and if you remember, in Octopus Deploy we had a CI/CD demo project, and also in infrastructure we had one environment called dev. I'm going to add a new environment as well, and also I have pushed a package called CI/CD demo. If I click on it, you will see that I have two versions of it. One of them is from master branch and one of them is from RC branch. Master branch sometimes can be deployed to dev environment because sometimes you want to create a baseline, for example. So this can go to dev environment, but RC can only go to production environment, or at least first to dev environment and then to production environment. So let's go and create a new environment. So we go to infrastructure and then environment tab, and we click on add environment. Let's call this prod or QA. It's up to you what you create. And once we have this environment, we have to go to the server that is hosting the tentacle and add a new tentacle. So let's do that as well. This is the server that is running my tentacle. I can add a second instance. So if I bring up the tentacle manager, you see that already a tentacle is running, but we can add a second one. What you need is this thumbprint. So copy it by clicking on this button and click on add new tentacle and give it a name, for example, prod. And click on get started. We want a listening tentacle, and we need to change the port because I already have a tentacle here, and we put the thumbprint as well. So as you see, now I have two tentacles. I can switch between these two by this drop down menu. Okay, so let's go back to Octopus Deploy. In Octopus Deploy, now I can create a deployment target. So we already have one, which is this one. So in order to add a new deployment target, I click on add new deployment target, and on my server is Windows and there is a listening tentacle there. My host name is localhost because the tentacle is on the same server that is hosting the Octopus Deploy, but the port is different. So we click on next. Display name, we can call this production or prod, and for the environment, that's a prod environment, and the role is website, and that's it. We can save it. So now if I go to connectivity, I can update Calamari. Remember that we always have to update the Calamari. Once the Calamari is updated, we are ready to create life cycles. So what we said was that we want to make sure before a package ends up in production environment, it goes to dev environment first, and we only want a package that has RC branch at the end of it to go to production. So if I go and click on the package, this version that has -rc can only go to production. So in order to create life cycles, we have to go to library menu and choose the life cycles tab. And as you see, default lifecycle says that you have to go to dev first and then to prod, and it applies to all projects, but we can create new lifecycles as well. So I can create a new lifecycle and we can call this develop or developer or anything that makes sense. And we can say deployment to development environment, something like this. And retention policy means that for how long the releases should be kept, you can say keep everything or keep for only like 3 days or something like this. And likewise, you can decide whether you want to keep the files on the tentacle servers or you want to delete them after a certain number of days. Then after that, you need to add phases. So every phase is basically limitations on environment and things like that. So we can say phase 1 development, for example, and it says which environment is related to this phase. Because we want to limit everything to dev environment, I have to click on add environment and click on this drop down and say dev. Now there are two options. If I choose the first option, which is not the default, as soon as you create a release, it will get deployed to this environment. This might be useful for continuously deploying to dev environment. But if you want to make sure a user actually triggers the deployment manually by clicking on deploy button, then you have to say, I want users to manually queue the deployment and run it. So I click on OK and I click on save. So I have one lifecycle. This lifecycle allows deployment to dev only because there is nothing after this dev. Now I can create another lifecycle just like default and say that for this one, this is like production lifecycle. And when we add a phase, so the phase 1 is like dev and environment is dev, we can say this is automatic, and then we click on save. And I need to add another phase, and this phase is production, and environment this time is production. For production, it's very unlikely that we say you can deploy automatically, and we click on save. So now I have a new lifecycle called production, and if we look at the lifecycle preview, we have dev and then we have production, and then dev, as you see, has a trigger in here. That means that deployment will automatically happen. Okay, so if I look at the lifecycles, we have default, which is fine, and then we have develop and production. Now for every project, if we want to change its default lifecycle, we have to go to channels. Every project has a default channel. If we click on it, then you can change the lifecycle to anything you want. For example, we can say the lifecycle is production, and we click on save. Now if I click a release, what happens is that as soon as I clicked on save the release, you see that dev deployment has started, and then the next step is production. So dev finished and then production became enabled. Before dev deployment became successful, the production was disabled and we couldn't deploy it. And then now I can deploy to production as well. But this time the deployment is manual. So as you see, when we have a lifecycle that has 2 steps, every step becomes a column. If we had a lifecycle that has, for example, 3 phases, then we would have 3 columns. And every tick tells us where this thing has been deployed to. And it's really good for change management. If you are a developer, you know that sometimes your boss comes and says, what happened to this bug fix? And you're like, I'm not sure if I deployed it. You can come to Octopus Deploy and see Okay, for example, we have deployed it to dev and QA. It's not in production yet, and it gives you a good visibility as to where a package has gone to so far. So in the next lecture, I want to explore this channel thing a bit more. You know that we came here and we changed the default lifecycle. This gives us more flexibility on what we deploy and who can deploy things.